sticking around or coming back. At least in the UK, it's getting a bit late, so I really appreciate it. And today I'll be talking about pseudo-inflected nonwords and why they're interesting. And this is work that I did together with Mirjana Bozic and Brechtje.
Julia, no worries. You can just press the arrows. Okay,
yes.
It's fine. Okay.
Thank you.
Cool.
Perfect. Okay. Hopefully the only technical problem today. The main topic about this is morphological priming, and a lot of you know about priming. But just to quickly recap, the use of morphological information in reading is well documented. That was also part of Kathy Russell's talk on Monday, so you probably remember this. And one of the really favored paradigms are priming paradigms. So something like Sheeter priming teacher, and the idea is that because they share the derivational affix here, teacher is facilitated through Sheeter, so it's responded to faster. And this has been done especially with stem priming and derivational affixes. And the idea is that because we find this priming effect, presumably morphological units and not just the whole words are important for lexical access. So what about inflectional suffix priming then? So the case where we're trying to prime the target that has the same inflection. And surprisingly here, this paradigm hasn't actually been used that much, so it's a fairly short literature review. And focusing on English, there are only 2 studies in the auditory modality. And the interesting thing here is that they don't agree. So Emore did not find significant priming that would be independent of other factors, such as syllables. But in a recent paper, Goodwin Davies and Embig did find significant morphological priming to suffixes. So we can say that the effects so far that have been found are inconclusive. And one thing that's being suggested is that this might reflect a functional difference between inflections and derivational affixes. And this makes sense linguistically, also neurologically to a certain extent. But what we wanted to do was to test other factors that might influence that, to see if maybe it isn't actually about functional differences here. And so specifically, we looked at some linguistic and extra-linguistic variables. Namely, we looked at the length and the prosodic structure of the suffixes. And this has to do with visual salience. So the more salient a prime is, the more likely it is to produce an effect, or at least that's what we presumed. And I won't comment too much on syllables today, but if it interests you, then do ask. We also were interested a bit in semantic factors because we're using nonwords, and individual differences, namely differences in reading proficiency. And I'll talk a bit more about this. Slow reading, and therefore presumably less proficient reading, has been found it has been related to a lower level of orthographic skill. And in a recent study by Medeiros and Dunya Beitia, they found that morphological effects to derived words, in fact, were much more pronounced for slow readers, so for presumably less proficient readers. And of course, we then thought that a similar effect could apply to inflected words, but also non-words. I'll explain a little bit about the idea behind this. So again, if you listen to Kathy Russell's talk on Monday, this will look very familiar. It's a very simple model of how we think we access visual information, specifically how we access visually presented words. There are 2 general pathways. One is this semantic pathway that maps the orthography, so the visual image, directly onto meaning, which is quite artificial. It needs to be learned. But it is also quite useful in the sense that a semantic pathway can potentially mitigate other pathways. And the other important pathway is the mapping from orthography to sound. And it seems likely that it might be the case that a poor reader who often have lower orthographic skills might be using the semantic pathway here, the pathway 1, more strongly as a compensatory strategy because they are not as skilled at the orthographic level. So what about non-words then? Non-words aren't stored in the mental lexicon, obviously, and therefore a semantic pathway is not available to assessing this word. If, for example, in a lexical decision task, when you're trying to figure out, is this a real word or not? So for reading out a non-word such as eep, you need to rely on your knowledge of orthography phonology and the mapping. So the reason I show you all this is because what we wanted to see is if a non-word is pseudo-inflected, so a non-word such as smoy carries an existing inflection in English, potentially pre-activating that could help us to assess that non-word. And the idea here is that the inflectional suffix essentially could function as a sublexical cue. And in particular, we wanted to see whether readers in general, but in particular whether poor readers might benefit from morphological pre-activation, so essentially priming in this way. So the experiment then had two main questions. Does pre-activation of inflections facilitate the processing of non-words in general? And the second aspect was whether this was modulated by individual differences in people's reading skill and vocabulary knowledge. And again, I think I said this, but non-words obviously aren't stored in the mental lexicon. And the benefit of using them here is that we reduce semantic interference, and instead we can fully concentrate on the contributions from the inflection. So the experiment was a visual priming experiment with a lexical decision task. Is this a real word, yes or no? We tested 3 different English suffixes, and we compared them to non-suffixed control words. We used real words and non-words, so we also have the real word data, but today I will only be focusing on the non-words. And the paradigm essentially looked something like this. Each target could be preceded by a baseline string, so something non-linguistic like these crosses here, followed by the target, or it could be preceded by the prime embedded in that string. And in this suffix condition, we would then expect something like facilitation. And to that, we matched control words, something like a non-word shangle, which doesn't have an obvious morphological structure. So just to remind you, we have 3 main conditions. We've got non-words primed only by 1 letter, such as the S inflection. We have non-words primed by 2 letters, such as modus. And we have non-words primed by 3 letters, such as the ing suffix. Each trial started with a row of hash marks, a 150 millisecond prime, then the target in uppercase letters, and as I said, a standard lexical decision task to that target word. We analyzed all of this with linear mixed models, starting with the maximal approach. I won't bore you too much with the statistics. Again, if you're interested, obviously do ask. So in this rather uninspiring table, it's a summary of essentially the reaction times. On the far left-hand side, you've got the 3 conditions, 1 letter, 2 letter, 3 letter primes. And if you then zoom to the far right of the screen, you can see the difference in priming between the complex and between the simple form. And note that only the 3-letter priming condition here, which in our experiment happened to be a full syllable, produced a significant priming difference between the 2 conditions. And I'll comment a bit more on this later, but we think that this has to do with salience. So here's the whole thing again as a nice graph. You can see on the x-axis the comparison between baseline and primed. Here to suffix targets such as SMOYING, so it's only on the 3-letter priming condition. And on the y-axis, you've got mean reaction time. And you see there's a very mild facilitation for a suffix target and a significant inhibition for a non-suffixed target. But you might also notice that this facilitating effect for the suffix target is actually quite small. And this brings us to the second part of the presentation. If you remember, what we were also interested in were individual differences and how much they could modulate the strength of this priming effect. So this is a very non-eye friendly summary of the model output, which are the estimates. Don't worry too much about it. The only thing that I want you to focus on is the fact that the interaction between priming and morphological complexity, here in the orange box, which essentially tells us, oh yeah, there might be a morphological priming effect. This effect was modulated by participants' error rates. And error rates can be quite a good measure to see how much vocabulary skill a person has. So this brings us to the other part, namely where the reading profile modulates the strength of our morphological priming. And the way we investigated this further is by median splits. So we calculated the error rates for all subjects, and then we split them by the median into those with a high error rate and those with a low error rate. And what we found was that here in the little box, only participants with a high error rate actually produced a morphological priming effect. And now you can see that it's not something like -3 milliseconds, but -13 milliseconds, which in visual priming is, you know, a relatively okay effect. We did the same thing with mean reaction time, so how fast somebody was responding. Again, split them into slow readers and fast readers. And again, it's very similar, only the slow readers, so presumably those who are less skilled readers, produced morphological priming. And also note that the inhibitory effect for the simple targets was unaffected by any of these splits. Right, so overall then, the data suggests that morphological cues are dependent on both linguistic and individual factors, namely the salience. So some of the differences that have been found between inflection and derivation could actually have to do with the length rather than functional differences. More interestingly, morphological priming in our study, in line with previous research, showed that it was modulated by participants' reading skill. And going back to our little triangle from the start, what we think this might show is that subjects who have a smaller vocabulary and lower reading skill, and because they're less efficient in the orthographic decoding, might benefit from a morphological pre-activation, here essentially the prime, as a sub-lexical semantic strategy. In this case, you can split up the word. The ing is really predictable, and therefore it can help you to identify that this is a non-word. To conclude this, the data suggests that morphological activation is not obligatory. It's not the case for all participants, at least not from the priming results. But it is nonetheless seems to be important in lexical access, at least in the visual modality. And we suggest that this is the case especially when a whole word semantic strategy and rapid orthographic decoding are unavailable. We would suggest that this pattern that we found is best explained in models that allow both direct access to words and decomposition mechanisms. That's everything for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions? Sure. Armine?
Right, sorry. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. And I have a question that is probably slightly off topic, but I think you are the expert in the field. So, so you mentioned that poor readers, as far as I understood, are those people with small vocabulary and poor reading skills. Would people with good vocabulary but poor reading skills qualify as poor readers? Because there are people, I'm doing some research on reading, and I was interested how to treat these people, because there are people who tell me I read really a lot of books, etc., but it takes me a lot of time to read.
Yeah, really interesting question. And first of all, I'm not an expert at all. I'm also a PhD student, so but I'll answer it as good as I can. We're actually, so all the things I said about vocabulary size and orthographic skill, these are things that are used in standard measures, but actually it's also things we presumed in our study, and that is, I mean, it's good you picked up on it because it's a limitation. So we're planning to verify this with some extra project with students. But to come back to your actual question, from the literature background, there's actually the idea that, the idea that I have seen is that actually readers can have different profiles. And some readers seem to have a more semantic profile, which would be probably those that have a good vocab knowledge, right, which you described, but they might still have poor orthographic mapping skills, and in that sense they could still be poor readers. Does that was that your question?
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up then. So would you say then, if one thinks of some experiments to tell whether people use either the semantic pathway or the orthographic pathway, that could be a good sign for whether they are poor readers in that sense or not?
Yeah, so that is the question. It really depends. The reason why I use both of these measures is because they seem to both tap into a lower processing skill visually, at least, you know, what we measured. And that was slightly independent from one another. So what you might expect perhaps is that it's exactly the same participants, but that wasn't the case. So they were truly independent effects of error rate and speed. So I think that both of them contribute what is a skilled reader, but this is how far my knowledge goes, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.